She was the savior of the Swedish dynasty, yet she is remembered as its coldest ghost. Born into the tragic bloodline of Queen Victoria and destined to be queen, Princess Sibylla's life was shattered in a single instant when a plane crash in 1947 killed her husband and incinerated her future. Left a widow at 39 with a 9-month-old future king in her arms, she faced a nightmare scenario, raising a monarch in a post-war country that despised her German roots. This is the untold story of the Iron Mother, a woman who sacrificed her own humanity and locked her grief in a steel box to ensure the survival of a crown she would never wear. Her story begins in the shadow of the greatest matriarch in history, Queen Victoria. Sibylla was born on January 18, 1908, at the Friedenstein Palace in Gotha, Germany. Her full name was a litany of royal alliances: Sibylla, Kalma, Marie, Alice Batildis, Feodora. She was a princess of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a title that sounds like a fairy tale but was, in reality, a political curse. Her father was Charles Edward, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His story is the key to understanding Sibylla's entire psychological landscape. Charles Edward was not born a German duke, he was born a British prince. He was the son of Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest and most intellectual son. He was born at Esher in Surrey. He went to Eton. He spoke English as his first language. He was Queen Victoria's favorite grandson, the little Charlie she doted on. But fate played a cruel trick on him. When he was just a teenager, the throne of the German Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha became vacant. The family needed an heir. They looked down the line of succession and their fingers landed on the teenage schoolboy at Eton. Despite his protests and despite his mother's weeping, Charles Edward was plucked from his comfortable English life and shipped off to Germany to rule a state he didn't know, in a language he barely spoke. He was a boy sacrificed on the altar of dynastic duty. And then the ultimate betrayal happened. When World War I broke out in 1914, Charles Edward found himself in an impossible position. He was a British prince ruling a German state. He was forced to fight for the Kaiser, his cousin, against the King of England, his other cousin. The reaction in Britain was savage. In 1917, the British Parliament passed the Titles Deprivation Act. Charles Edward was branded a traitor. He was stripped of his British titles. He was removed from the Order of the Garter. His banners were taken down from St. George's Chapel at Windsor and thrown into the dirt. He went from being a beloved British prince to a pariah, a man without a country. Sibylla grew up in the toxic atmosphere of her father's bitterness. She watched as her father, humiliated and rejected by the family he loved, turned his anger outward. He drifted toward the extreme right wing of German politics. He began to associate with the Freikorps, the paramilitaries, and eventually the National Socialists. Sibylla was raised in a castle where the portraits of Queen Victoria hung on the walls, but where the conversation at the dinner table was increasingly filled with the poisonous rhetoric of the wounded German nationalism. This was Sibylla's inheritance, a deep conflicting duality. On one hand, she was a Coburg, a member of the most prestigious royal house in Europe. On the other hand, she was the daughter of a traitor, a woman who learned early on that the world was a dangerous place, where titles could be stripped and safety could vanish overnight. She grew into a woman who embodied the Coburg aesthetic perfectly. She had the heavy-lidded blue eyes, the strong jawline, and the pale blonde hair of her ancestors. She was educated in the arts, she painted, she played music, but she was also undeniably stiff. She lacked the easy charm of her British cousins. She was raised in a court that valued protocol above personality and obedience above emotion. She was a good princess, dutiful, silent, and rigid. By the early 1930s, she was of marriageable age. In the royal marriage market of Europe, she was a blue-chip stock. Despite her father's political leanings, her bloodline was impeccable. She was the great-granddaughter of Victoria. She was the cousin of the King of England. She was a prize. And the man who came to claim her was the Golden Prince of the North, Prince Gustaf Adolf of Sweden, known to the family as Edmund, was everything a prince should be. He was the eldest son of the Crown Prince of Sweden. He was tall, athletic, a champion equestrian who had competed in the Olympics. He was handsome, charming, and widely adored by the Swedish people. He represented the future of the Bernadotte dynasty, a modern, active, shining future. When the engagement between Sibylla and Gustaf Adolf was announced in 1932, it was hailed as a great match. It was a reunion of the Victorian lines. It was a love match, two, or at least as close to one as royalty usually gets. They had met in London at the wedding of a cousin, and there was a genuine spark. Sibylla, usually so reserved, seemed to blossom in Edmund's presence. He made her laugh. He softened her edges. But the wedding itself, held in Coburg in October 1932, was a surreal and ominous affair. It was the last great royal gathering before the curtain of darkness fell across Europe. The streets of Coburg were lined with cheering crowds, but among the flags of the royal houses there were other flags, swastika flags. Adolf Hitler was not yet chancellor. That would happen a few months later, but his influence was already strangling Coburg. Sibylla's father was an enthusiastic supporter. There were Nazis in the crowd. There were SA stormtroopers standing near the carriage. For the visiting British and Swedish royals, it was a moment of deep discomfort. They were dancing on the edge of a volcano. Sibylla, in her white satin gown and her lace veil, looked like a vision of the past. But she was marrying into a future that would be defined by the very forces gathering outside the cathedral doors. She was leaving the toxicity of Coburg for the clean, neutral air of Sweden, unaware that the shadow of her hometown would follow her for the rest of her life. The arrival in Sweden was a culture shock of epic proportions. Sibylla stepped off the train in Stockholm expecting a court like the one she had left, formal, rigid, hierarchical. Instead, she found the Bernadottes. The Swedish royal family in the 1930s was unique. They were actively trying to modernize. They rode bicycles. They walked in the streets. They valued a certain kind of folksy accessibility. Sibylla did not know how to be folksy. She knew how to curtsy. She knew how to stand in a receiving line for 4 hours without fainting. She knew who outranked whom, but she didn't know how to chat with a fishmonger. She spoke Swedish, but with a heavy, guttural German accent that grated on the ears of the locals. She was shy, and her shyness was misinterpreted as arrogance. When she was nervous, she retreated into protocol. The Swedes, who wanted a smiling, waving princess, found her cold. They called her the German. It wasn't an insult yet, but it was a label, a way of marking her as other. But Sibylla had a mission that superseded popularity. She had one job, written into her marriage contract and her DNA, to provide an heir to the Swedish throne. The Bernadotte dynasty operated under the Salic law. This meant that only males could inherit the crown. Women were excluded from the succession. The situation in the 1930s was precarious. The king was old. The crown prince was aging. Prince Gustaf Adolf was the hope of the future, but he needed a son. If he didn't produce a son, the line of succession would become thin and fragile. The pressure on Sibylla was immense. It was not just a private desire for a family. It was a matter of state security. The newspapers speculated on her fertility. The court watched her waistline with predatory intensity. In 1934, 2 years after the wedding, the announcement came. The princess was pregnant. The excitement was palpable. Cannons were prepped. Names were discussed. In October 1934, she gave birth. It was a girl, Princess Margaretha. The disappointment was carefully masked, but it was there. A lovely princess, the paper said. Next time, a prince. Sibylla, dutiful as ever, tried again. In 1937, she gave birth. Another girl, Princess Brigitte. In 1938, she gave birth. Another girl, Princess Désirée. By now, the situation was becoming a national joke, albeit a nervous one. The Haga princesses, as they were called because the family lived at the beautiful Haga Palace just outside Stockholm, were undeniably adorable. They were blonde, photogenic, and charming. The magazines loved them. Pictures of the 3 little girls playing in the snow were bestsellers. They were the Shirley Temples of Scandinavia. But inside the palace, the tension was ratcheting up. 3 pregnancies, 3 daughters, no heir. The German princess was failing in her primary duty. There were whispers of a curse. People looked at the old Queen Victoria bloodline and remembered the genetic tragedies, wondering if Sibylla was somehow biologically incapable of producing a king. Then came the war. In 1939, World War II erupted. Sweden declared neutrality, but it was a terrified neutrality. The country was squeezed between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and Sibylla became a lightning rod for anxiety. Her father, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, was now a full-blown Nazi. He was wearing the uniform. He was friends with Hitler. Sibylla was not a Nazi. There is no evidence she ever supported the ideology. But she was a German woman living in the Swedish royal palace while her father was Heiling Hitler. The optics were disastrous. She became isolated. She focused entirely on her family, creating a cocoon at Haga Palace, trying to shut out the world that was judging her. In 1943, in the depths of the war, she was pregnant again. Surely this time, she gave birth, a 4th girl, Princess Christina. It seemed like a cosmic joke. 4 daughters, a nursery full of princesses who could not inherit the throne. The dynasty was teetering. If anything happened to her husband, the crown would pass to his elderly uncle or cousins who had lost their rights by marrying commoners. The Bernadotte line looked like it might extinguish itself. But Sibylla possessed the stubbornness of the Coburgs. She would not give up. She was entering her late 30s. The window was closing. In 1946, the war was over. The world was rebuilding. And at Haga Palace, there was one final desperate roll of the biological dice. Sibylla was pregnant for the 5th time. The entire nation held its breath. The king prayed. On April 30th, 1946, the news broke. A boy. The relief was seismic. It was not just happiness, it was salvation. Cannons fired 21-gun salutes across the archipelago. Strangers hugged in the streets. He was named Carl Gustaf Folke Hubertus. He was tiny, he was healthy, and he was the future king. Sibylla had done it. She was 38 years old. She had endured the sneers, the pressure, the war, and the 4 disappointments. She had fulfilled her contract. She was finally the mother of the heir. The months that followed were the golden hour of Sibylla's life. For the first time, she could relax. At Haga Palace, life was idyllic. There are photos from this time that break your heart to look at now. Prince Gustav Adolf holding his baby son up to the sun. Sibylla laughing, actually laughing, with her daughters running around her. They were a complete family. They had survived the war. They had secured the succession. The hard part was over. They had everything, and they had no idea that the clock was ticking down to 0. The winter of 1947 was cold. In January, Prince Gustav Adolf traveled to the Netherlands to hunt wild boar with Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard. It was a standard royal trip. Sibylla stayed at Haga with the baby and the girls. On January 26th, the prince boarded the KLM flight at Schiphol Airport to return to Stockholm. The plane, a Douglas DC-3, made a scheduled stop at Kastrup Airport in Copenhagen. It was a routine stopover. The prince, impatient to get home to his wife and his new son, stayed on board while the plane refueled. The plane taxied to the runway. The weather was fine. The engines roared to life. The pilot, Captain Gerrit Geisendorfer, was a war hero, one of the best in the business. As the plane lifted off the tarmac, climbing steeply into the Danish sky, nobody on board knew that a small metal pin, the elevator lock, had been overlooked by the ground crew. It was a mistake so small, so trivial, that it defies comprehension. But it was enough. At an altitude of 150 feet, the plane stalled. It banked sharply to the left. Gravity, indifferent to the rank of the passengers, took hold. The plane fell out of the sky like a stone. It hit the ground, nose first. The fuel tanks ruptured. The explosion was immediate and total. At Haga Palace, the phone began to ring, and Sibylla, still smiling from the memory of her husband's last letter, reached out her hand to answer it, unaware that she was reaching into the fire. The voice on the other end of the line was about to deliver a blow that would shatter the carefully constructed reality of the Swedish court. In a single instant, the domestic tranquility of Haga Palace was annihilated, replaced by a vacuum of shock that would suck the air out of the room for decades to come. The telephone at Haga Palace did not just ring, it screamed in the silence of the winter afternoon. When Sibylla picked it up, or perhaps when she saw the face of her father-in-law, the crown prince, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his face, the golden era of the Haga family evaporated instantly. The words that followed were impossible to process. A crash. Copenhagen. No survivors. Edmund is dead. It is difficult for us, living in an age of constant information and public grief, to understand the sheer, suffocating weight of that moment for Sibylla. She was 39 years old. Her youngest child, the future king, was 9 months old. Her eldest was 12. She was a foreigner in a country that merely tolerated her, and her only anchor to safety, her only true friend in Sweden, had just been incinerated on a Danish runway. The immediate aftermath of the crash was a blur of state protocol and private agony. The body of Prince Gustaf Adolf was brought back to Sweden on a battleship. As the ship pulled into Stockholm harbor, cutting through the ice, thousands of people stood on the quays in silence. They held torches. They wept for their golden prince, the sportsman, the father, the hope of the dynasty. But inside the palace, the grief was being managed with a terrifying rigidity. Sibylla was not allowed the luxury of collapsing. She was the mother of the future king. She was a Coburg. She had to stand straight. The funeral took place in the Storkirken Cathedral. Sibylla, swathed in heavy black mourning veils that obscured her face, stood by the coffin. She looked like a statue carved from obsidian. She did not weep publicly. She did not faint. She stood with her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. To the Swedish public, this stoicism was confusing. Some saw it as strength. Others, still suspicious of her German blood, saw it as coldness. "She doesn't even cry," they whispered. "She is made of ice." They did not know that beneath the veil, Sibylla was in a state of shock so profound that it threatened to stop her heart. She was a woman who had been raised to believe that emotion was a weakness, and now, faced with the greatest tragedy of her life, she reverted to her training. She locked the pain away in a vault deep inside her, swallowed the key, and threw away the map. But the true tragedy of Sibylla's widowhood was not the funeral. It was what happened after the guests had gone home. In the weeks following the crash, a decision was made by the royal family that, in hindsight, seems almost cruel in its Victorian pragmatism. The old king, Gustaf V, and the crown prince decided that the best way to protect the children from the pain of their father's death was to erase him. Silence descended on Haga Palace. The children were told that Papa has gone to heaven, and then the subject was closed. His name was not mentioned at the dinner table. His office was cleared. His clothes were packed away. There were no reminiscences, no, "Do you remember when Papa did this?" No shared tears. It was a total hermetic erasure. Decades later, King Carl XVI Gustaf, the baby who was left fatherless, would speak about this culture of silence with heartbreaking honesty. He said he grew up without a father, but also without a memory of a father. He didn't dare ask his mother about him because he sensed her fragility. He knew, even as a child, that if he pulled that thread, his mother would unravel. So Sibylla and her children lived in a house of ghosts. She sat at the head of the table, smiling tightly, asking about schoolwork, discussing the weather, while the empty chair at the other end screamed in the silence. She became the enforcer of this repression. She believed she was doing the right thing, the strong thing. She believed she was saving them from trauma. In reality, she was freezing the trauma in place, preserving it like a fly in amber. This emotional isolation was compounded by a political storm that was gathering outside the palace gates. The year was 1947. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The Nuremberg trials were exposing the full industrial horror of the Nazi regime to a stunned world, and the spotlight of history began to turn toward the bystanders and the collaborators. Sibylla was German. That was bad enough in post-war Europe, but she wasn't just any German. She was the daughter of Charles Edward, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. While Sibylla was mourning her husband in Stockholm, her father was sitting in an American internment camp in Germany. Charles Edward had not been a passive observer of the Third Reich. He had been an enthusiastic participant. He had joined the Nazi Party. He had worn the uniform of an Obergruppenführer in the SA. He had served as president of the German Red Cross under the Nazis, presiding over an organization that was complicit in the regime's crimes, including the euthanasia program. In 1947, Charles Edward was put on trial by a denazification court. He was classified as a Mitläufer and heavily fined, escaping prison only because of his poor health. But the damage to his reputation, and by extension his daughter's, was catastrophic. The Swedish press, uncensored and angry, began to ask questions. How close was Princess Sibylla to her Nazi father? Did she share his views? Why was a woman with such a tainted bloodline raising the future king of Sweden? Sibylla found herself in a nightmare scenario. She was a widow, alone in a foreign country, while her father was being branded a war criminal on the world stage. The whispers in Stockholm grew louder. She was the German woman. People remembered the wedding in Coburg with the swastikas. They remembered her accent. They forgot her service during the war, her quiet support of Swedish charities. They only saw the daughter of a Nazi. She was ostracized. The warm, folksy affection the Swedes felt for the rest of the royal family evaporated when it came to Sibylla. She felt the chill in the air when she entered a room. She saw the way conversations stopped. She felt the judgment of the court. Under this immense pressure, the grief, the silence, the political suspicion, Sibylla changed. The softness of the young mother who had laughed in the garden at Haga vanished. In her place emerged a figure of steel and discipline. She became the Iron Mother. She realized that she had only one purpose left in life: to ensure that her son Carl Gustaf survived to take the throne. The dynasty was hanging by a thread. The old king was 90, the crown prince was 65, the new heir was a toddler. If anything happened to him, the Bernadotte line would face a constitutional crisis that could end the monarchy. Sibylla dedicated her existence to protecting the crown prince. She wrapped him in cotton wool, but she also subjected him to a rigorous, demanding education. She was terrified of spoiling him. She was terrified that without a father, he would grow up weak. So she became the disciplinarian. She was strict, formal, and demanding. Life at Haga Palace settled into a routine of dutiful performance. Sibylla would wake up, put on her mask of composure, and go to work. She took over her late husband's patronages. She cut ribbons. She attended committee meetings. She worked harder than anyone else in the family, driven by a desperate need to prove her loyalty to Sweden. If I work hard enough, she seemed to think, maybe they will forgive me for being German. Maybe they will forgive me for surviving. But there was no joy in it. Photographs from this period show a woman who looks decades older than her years. Her face is etched with deep lines of tension. Her eyes are guarded. She rarely smiles, and when she does, it doesn't reach her eyes. She smoked incessantly, a habit that calmed her nerves but slowly eroded her health. Yet, amidst the gloom, there were flashes of the woman she used to be. In the summers, the family would retreat to Soledane Palace on the island of Öland. There, away from the prying eyes of the court and the press, Sibylla would relax slightly. She would swim in the Baltic Sea. She would play cards with her daughters. For a few weeks a year, the iron mask would slip, and her children would see a glimpse of the mother who had been stolen from them by the crash. But these moments were fleeting. The reality of her position was always waiting for her back in Stockholm. She was the white widow, the ghost in the machine of the monarchy. As the 1950s dawned, Sibylla faced a new challenge. Her daughters, the Haga princesses, were growing up. They were beautiful, modern, and restless. They wanted to live like normal teenagers. They wanted to go to parties, date boys, drive cars. They were the first generation of celebrity royals chased by paparazzi, their love lives splashed across the tabloids. Sibylla, with her Victorian upbringing and her terror of scandal, found this terrifying. She tried to control them, to keep them within the rigid boundaries of royal protocol. But it was a losing battle. The world was changing. Rock and roll was here. The stiff, formal world of Coburg was dead, and her daughters were embracing the new era. This created friction. The daughters saw their mother as old-fashioned, strict, and unfeeling. They didn't understand the trauma she was carrying. They didn't understand that her strictness was born of fear that one wrong step would bring the whole fragile house of cards crashing down. And at the center of it all was the little boy, Carl Gustaf. He was a shy, dyslexic child who loved nature and cars. He was growing up in a house of women watched over by a mother who looked at him with a mixture of fierce love and terrifying expectation. Every time she looked at him, she saw the husband she had lost and the king he had to become. It was a heavy burden for a little boy to carry, and a heavy burden for a mother to place. By the mid-1950s, Sibylla had stabilized the ship. The succession was secure, the children were healthy, but she remained a figure apart, a lonely woman pacing the halls of a palace that felt too big, waiting for a future that she was building for someone else. She was the regent in all but name, the guardian of the flame, keeping the fire burning through the long, cold Swedish night, waiting for her son to come of age. She did not know it then, but she was entering the final act of her life. The years of stress, of smoke, and of suppressed grief were beginning to take their toll. The body can only hold so much sorrow before it begins to break. But the fracture lines in Sibylla's life were not just physical, they were generational. As the mourning veils were put away and the children grew, the silent fortress she had built at Haga began to tremble under the assault of a new, rebellious era that had no patience for Victorian stoicism. As the 1950s broke over Sweden, bringing with them the bright plastic optimism of the post-war era, Princess Sibylla found herself standing on a tectonic fault line. One side of her life was anchored in the rigid, dutiful past of the Victorian courts where she had been raised. The other side was being pulled violently toward a modern future she did not understand. A future of rock and roll, rebellion, and a media culture that was beginning to devour its idols. Inside the gilded cage of Haga Palace, the silence regarding the dead Prince Gustaf Adolf remained absolute, but the noise of the living was becoming impossible to ignore. Sibylla was no longer just the grieving widow or the suspect German. She was now the single mother of 4 teenage daughters and a shy little boy who carried the weight of a 500-year-old monarchy in his school bag. The saga of the Haga princesses, Margarita, Birgitta, Desiree, and Christina, is the subplot that gives Sibylla's tragedy its domestic texture. To the Swedish public, these 4 girls were the darlings of the nation. They were the first generation of royals to grow up in the camera lens. They were beautiful, blonde, and seemingly carefree. But for Sibylla, they were a terrifying challenge. She was a mother operating without a map. She had been raised in Coburg, where a princess spoke only when spoken to, married a German prince, and dedicated her life to needlepoint and duty. Her daughters, however, were growing up in social democratic Sweden. They wanted to listen to Elvis Presley. They wanted to drive cars. They wanted to go to dances with boys who didn't have titles. Sibylla responded the only way she knew how, with control. She tried to impose the strict etiquette of her youth on a household of modern teenagers. It was a collision of centuries. Arguments flared behind the palace doors. The daughters chafed against the iron mother's restrictions, seeing her as cold and old-fashioned. They didn't see the fear that drove her rigidity. They didn't see that every time Sibylla looked at them, she saw the fragility of their position. They were fatherless royals in a country that was debating the abolition of the monarchy. One scandal, one wrong step, could bring the whole house of cards down. But the true center of Sibylla's anxiety was not the girls. It was the boy. Crown Prince Carl Gustaf, Lille Prinsen, was the son around which Sibylla's universe revolved. He was a sweet, quiet child, deeply affected by the loss of the father he couldn't remember. He was also dyslexic, a condition that was poorly understood at the time. In the high-pressure environment of royal education, where he was expected to make speeches and read documents, his struggles with reading were a source of immense stress. Sibylla was fiercely protective of him, but her protection took the form of rigorous preparation. She was terrified that he would be seen as weak or stupid. She pushed him. She surrounded him with tutors. She filled his schedule with duties. There is a heartbreaking loneliness to the image of Sibylla and her son in these years, the widow and the orphan, clinging to each other in a palace full of servants, united by a destiny neither of them had chosen. She was his mother, but she was also his commanding officer. She had to toughen him up. She sent him to boarding school at Sigtuna and later to the military. She repressed her own maternal instinct to coddle him because she knew the world would not coddle a king. It was a sacrifice of intimacy for the sake of survival, and it is a sacrifice that haunts the current king's eyes to this day. However, as the 1960s arrived, the dynamic of Sibylla's life shifted once again. The German pariah began to undergo a slow, quiet rehabilitation. Time is a great healer, or at least a great amnesiac. As the memories of the war faded, the venom directed at Sibylla began to dilute. The Swedish people saw a woman who had not remarried, who had not fled, and who had raised their future king with quiet dignity. They began to respect her stamina. She was no longer the Nazi's daughter. She was simply Princess Sibylla, the fixture at the ribbon cuttings, the lady in the sensible hat who never complained. The turning point came in 1965 with the death of Queen Louise. Queen Louise Mountbatten, Sibylla's mother-in-law, had been the glue holding the court together. She was the eccentric, popular, chain-smoking queen who had bridged the gap between the monarchy and the people. When she died, a massive vacuum opened up at the heart of the royal family. The king, Gustaf VI Adolf, was now an 82-year-old widower. He was lonely, frail, and in need of a female figure to manage the court and act as the first lady of the kingdom. There was only one candidate. Sibylla stepped out of the shadows of Haga Palace and into the spotlight of the royal palace in Stockholm. She effectively became the Queen of Sweden in all but name. She moved into the massive, drafty apartments of the palace. She took over the Queen's schedule. She sat beside the old king at the opening of Parliament. She hosted the Nobel Prize banquets. For the first time in her life, Sibylla had a role that fit her training. She was excellent at it. She knew protocol better than anyone. She knew how to organize a state dinner for 200 people without breaking a sweat. She brought a sense of grandeur and correctness back to the court. And something strange happened. She began to enjoy it. Away from the crushing pressure of raising young children alone, Sibylla relaxed slightly. She developed a circle of friends known as the Wednesday Club, aristocrats and old friends, with whom she could speak German and reminisce about the old days. With them she was funny, warm, and even sarcastic. She loved to play cards. She smoked her cigarettes with gusto. But the public rarely saw this side of her. To the cameras she remained the Sphinx. She had worn the mask of stoicism for so long that she couldn't take it off. She smiled, but it was a practiced, professional smile. She was respected, but she was not loved. The Swedes admired her work ethic, but they didn't want to hug her. There was a profound sadness in this partial redemption. She was finally doing the job she was born for, ruling a court. But she was doing it as a widow, not a wife. She was the consort to her father-in-law, not her husband. Every time she sat on the throne chair next to the king, the empty space where Edmund should have been was palpable. The late 1960s also brought the emptying of the nest. The Haga princesses, one by one, fought their battles for love and won. They married commoners, businessmen, and minor barons. They left the royal goldfish bowl. Sibylla, initially resistant to these matches, eventually capitulated. She walked her daughters down the aisle one by one, watching them leave to build the normal lives she had never been allowed to have. And then the crown prince moved out. Carl Gustaf came of age. He was a handsome, if somewhat shy, young man, fond of fast cars and beautiful women. He was ready to take his place in the world. Sibylla was left alone in the vast apartments of the royal palace. The silence that had begun with the phone call in 1947 was now total. She was in her early 60s, but she looked older. The years of stress had etched deep lines into her face. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed silver. She was tired, but she couldn't rest. Not yet. The grand project wasn't finished. The old king, Gustaf VI Adolf, was a biological marvel, living well into his late 80s, but he could not live forever. Sibylla knew that the transition was coming. She had to keep the monarchy stable until Carl Gustaf, could take the crown. She had to ensure there were no scandals, no mistakes. She felt like a runner in a relay race, holding the baton with a death grip, waiting for the finish line. Her health began to falter. She had always ignored her own well-being. She smoked too much. She ignored aches and pains. She belonged to a generation that believed going to the doctor was a form of self-indulgence. When she felt ill, she simply worked harder. In the early months of 1972, the pain in her stomach began. It was a gnawing, persistent pain that she couldn't explain away with stress. She tried to hide it. She ordered her clothes to be taken in as she lost weight. She applied more rouge to cover her pallor. She stood at the receiving lines, shaking hands for hours while a tumor grew silently inside her. It was the final act of the Iron Mother. She was determined not to be an invalid. She was determined not to distract from her son's impending accession. She was playing a game of chicken with death, trying to hold it off just long enough to see the coronation. But cancer, unlike the press or the politicians, does not care about royal protocol. By the autumn of 1972, the secret could no longer be kept. She collapsed. The doctors were summoned. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced colorectal cancer. It had spread. It was inoperable. The news was kept from the public, and to an extent, even from the king. Sibylla retreated to her apartments. The White Widow began to fade. It is a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions that, as Sibylla lay dying in November 1972, the old king was still alive, frail but functioning. The son she had raised to be king was still the crown prince. She had spent 25 years, a quarter of a century, sacrificing everything for a single moment, the moment she would curtsy to her son as King of Sweden. She was so close, just months away. As the winter darkness descended on Stockholm once again, echoing the darkness of that terrible day in 1947, Sibylla prepared for her final journey. She had no husband to hold her hand. Her children gathered around her, finally seeing the vulnerability of the one who had been their rock and their warden. She looked back on a life that had been a series of near misses. She had nearly been a British princess. She had nearly been a queen consort. She had nearly had a happy ending. But Sibylla was not bitter. She was tired. She had done her duty. She had kept the promise she made to a dead man in a coffin 25 years earlier. She had saved his son. She had saved his dynasty. By late 1972, it was obvious that Sibylla was running out of time. Everyone around her could see that her body was finally giving in to the years of strain. On November 28, 1972, the heavy oak doors of the royal palace in Stockholm closed on the life of Princess Sibylla. She died as she had lived for the past 25 years, quietly, discreetly, and just a few steps away from the throne she had sacrificed everything to protect. She was 64 years old. In the grand timeline of the Swedish monarchy, her death was not a constitutional crisis. The heir was ready, the king was still alive, but it was a moment of profound, aching pathos. Sibylla had missed the finish line by less than 10 months. The grand project of her widowhood, the dream of seeing her son Carl Gustaf crowned king, remained unfulfilled. She had run the marathon, carrying the crushing weight of the dynasty on her back, only to collapse within sight of the stadium. Her funeral was held at the Storkyrkan Cathedral, the same cavernous space where she had stood in her heavy black veils 25 years earlier, watching her husband's coffin. This time, the coffin was hers. The crowds that gathered were respectful, but they were not hysterical. Sweden still didn't quite know what to make of Sibylla. They knew they were losing a fixture of the court, a hard-working princess, but they didn't feel they were losing a friend. The German label, the Iron Mother reputation, the stiffness, it all created a barrier that even death couldn't entirely dissolve. But if you looked at the faces of her children in the front pew, the story was different. The four princesses, Margarita, Brigitte, Desiree, and Christina, were weeping for a mother whose strictness they now understood was born of terrified love. And standing slightly apart, looking devastatingly young and alone, was Crown Prince Carl Gustaf. He was 26 years old. He had lost his father before he could walk, and now he had lost his mother before he could reign. Sibylla was laid to rest at the royal cemetery at Haga, in the woodland park she loved. She was buried next to her husband, Prince Gustav Adolf. It was a reunion that had been delayed for a quarter of a century. Finally, the White Widow could lay down her burden. Finally, the silence of the palace didn't matter anymore, but the machinery of the monarchy, which Sibylla had oiled so diligently, could not stop for grief. 10 months later, on September 15th, 1973, the old king, Gustav VI Adolf, died at the age of 90. The long Victorian twilight was officially over. On the balcony of the royal palace, a 27-year-old man stepped out to face his people. King Carl XVI Gustaf. He was the youngest monarch in the world. He stood there squinting slightly in the autumn sun, looking incredibly solitary. There was no queen consort beside him. There was no mother behind him to whisper instructions. There was no father to guide him. He was the solitary king. But he was ready. When he spoke, when he took his oath, the court and the government realized something startling. The boy was prepared. He knew the protocol. He knew the history. He had a sense of duty that was ironclad. This was Sibylla's legacy. This was what the 25 years of strictness, of boarding schools, of don't cry, and of rigorous training had produced. She had forged a king out of a shy, dyslexic, fatherless boy. She had done it alone, under fire, and she had done it well. The stability of the Swedish monarchy today, its survival through the radical politics of the 1970s, is largely due to the discipline Sibylla instilled in her son. However, the true reevaluation of Sibylla's life didn't happen immediately. It took decades for the ice to melt. For decades, the narrative remained frozen on the image of Sibylla the German, the cold and distant mother. Yet, as the 21st century dawned, the ice began to melt. King Carl XVI Gustaf himself broke the silence, speaking not with bitterness, but with mature compassion. He revealed that what the world saw as coldness was actually a generation's desperate attempt to survive trauma. They believed silence was strength, and repression was the only shield they had. Historians began to look at the archives again. They looked at the letters Sibylla wrote, at the schedule of her engagements. They saw a woman who worked herself to death for a country that rejected her. They saw the impossible position she was in, the daughter of a war criminal trying to lead a democratic nation. They saw the Iron Mother not as a monster, but as a desperate widow trying to build a fortress around her children. The tragedy of Sibylla of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha is that she was a woman out of time. She was a Victorian relic trying to survive in a modern world. She believed in the divine right of kings, in the sanctity of bloodlines, and in the absolute necessity of duty. These were the values that saved the dynasty, but they were also the values that isolated her from her own humanity. Today, if you visit the Haga Palace, which is now the home of Crown Princess Victoria and her family, the atmosphere is very different. It is full of light, noise, and happy children. The silence is gone. But in the quiet corners of the park, near the royal cemetery, you can still feel the weight of the past. Sibylla's story serves as a haunting reminder of the cost of the crown. We often look at royalty and see the privilege, the castles, and the jewels. We forget the biological trap of it. We forget the women like Sibylla who are treated as breeding stock, who are blamed for the gender of their children, and who are expected to bear the unbearable without shedding a tear. She was not a warm figure. She was not a people's princess. She did not hug strangers or give tearful interviews. She was a creature of the old world, stiff and proud. But she possessed a heroism that is rare in any age, the heroism of simply showing up. She showed up when she was hated. She showed up when she was grieving. She showed up when she was dying. And perhaps, in the final analysis, that is enough. As we look back at the white-hot tragedy of the plane crash and the long, cold winter that followed, we should not judge Sibylla for her silence. We should respect her for her survival. She was the anchor that held the ship in the storm, even as she drowned in the waves.